Okay.
Welcome, Paul, who is all the way from Alabama, USA. It is 4 o'clock in the morning for him, and I'm glad that he's able to join us. And welcome as well to the other students who might end up joining us tonight, or who will end up watching a recording of tonight's tutorial. So tonight, we will cover the topics for weeks 4 to 6 pertaining to corporate governance. And if you recall, when we went through weeks 1 to 6, we had started to talk about what corporate governance is all about. We talked about what the duties of directors might be. Because when we talk about corporate governance is mainly about the systems, the framework, the procedures, the policies that affect the way that the authority in a company is being exercised. And it also talks about accountability in the company. And so traditionally or conventionally, therefore, when we speak of corporate governance, we usually speak from the context of the board of directors, who by law are actually the repository of corporate power. So it is the board of directors acting collectively, which exercise the powers of the company or of the corporation. And given the fact that they are given authority by law, then it is only logical that at some point, when you speak of corporate governance as a concept, there came about the idea that these people in authority or the board of directors should also be held accountable for what they did. So we covered that in week 1. We talked about the crisis of corporate governance in the sense that we've had instances in the past and even in recent years whereby huge companies failed or they collapsed because of a crisis of corporate governance. In other words, one, there was a failure on the part of the board of directors to properly exercise their powers in the board. So they were probably loose in terms of allowing management to really manage the day-to-day affairs of the company. And you've had instances where there was a fudging of accounting books. There were instances, for example, of inflated sales when they did not exist. And mainly because in many cases in the past, as far back as the 1960s, there had been an observation that the board of directors, who oftentimes were beholden to the chief executive officer, would just sign off on anything that the chief executive officer would do for as long as they were happy with the kind of compensation that they were getting. And so, especially as a result of the massive corporate collapses in the 1990s in the US, and especially as a result of the financial economic crisis starting in about 2008 worldwide, where we saw the collapse of huge companies and the need for the United States government, for example, to bail out companies such as AIG, one of the largest insurance companies in the world, or to bail out Toyota and Ford in the United States, and a lot of the other companies, and the collapse of the fourth largest accounting firm then, which was Arthur Andersen. It was then clear that there was a need for a legal framework that clearly indicated what levels of accountability should exist on the part of the board of directors. So we covered this in week 1. And we also made a distinction between the board of directors as opposed to the managers, because while the board of directors may have the ultimate authority in terms of making corporate decisions, or whatever, in terms of the strategic decisions of the company long term, what markets it should enter into, what acquisitions should be made, what products should be launched. While the ultimate decision was made by the board of directors, ultimately, however, when you looked at the day-to-day activities of the business, obviously it wasn't the board of directors that does this, it is the management. And I also indicated in the past, in the tutorials and in the study guide, that when you look at the discourse in the MBA programs and you look at the discourse in management in the 1990s and even in the 1980s and earlier, a lot of the discussion actually focused on management, what the role of management was, and there was very little discussion about corporate governance and the role of the board of directors. So if you look at the book on management by a well-known author, who was Richard Daft, when he talks about management, there was hardly any reference to the board of directors. So management would, because this is an MBA program, as you would probably be familiar, we talk about management, talk about the basic tasks of management, of planning, organizing, leading, and controlling, which are essentially managerial activities. But these aren't really the activities that we would associate with the board of directors. And so in the previous weeks, we talked about the distinction between the board of directors, what the roles are, as opposed to the roles of management who actually undertakes the day-to-day operations of the decisions, although they are meant to be overseen and supervised by the board of directors. And then we talked about, in particular, what the legal duties are of the director. So when we talk about directors' duties, we're actually indicating that directors have a duty in law, both on the basis of the Corporations Act in Australia, as well as on the basis of the common law. So when we speak, for example, when we speak of the Corporations Act, it means that there is a law on the basis of a statute passed by the Commonwealth Parliament of Australia. So in other words, like as citizens of Australia or citizens of other countries, for those who belong to other jurisdictions, we know that the Parliament, or in the US, we know that the Congress in the US, which comprises both the US Senate as well as the House of Representatives, they pass statutes or they pass laws which govern the activities of people and govern the activities of companies in the United States. So that is in the form of statutes. But another source of law is what we know to be the common law. And the common law are principles and legal rules that have been formulated by the courts. And because they have been formulated by the courts, even in the absence of statutes, even in the absence of enactments passed by the legislature, these are binding. And the common law recognizes that directors have certain duties. And if directors, for example, fail to, I made sure it was recording. Okay, it's recording. And if directors, therefore, fail to fulfill their duties on the basis of the common law, then they can be held liable. The problem, however, if you look at the idea of common law, is that the common law takes a while to kick in because of the nature of jurisprudence, or what we call in particular stare decisis. So the courts don't just change legal principles overnight, because it has oftentimes a lower court would have to abide by decisions that have already been handed down by superior courts. And so therefore, oftentimes the government institution that is in a better position to formulate legal principles would actually be the legislature. In the US, it's Congress, and in Australia, it is the Commonwealth Parliament. Because at any time, the legislature can just pass a law. So it should be therefore clear that as far as directors' duties are concerned, these are governed both by statute as well as the common law. And we also need to recognize that as far as directors' duties are concerned, we also need to recognize that directors' duties are not simply based on the Corporations Act in Australia, but also on the basis of a wide array of statutes, which means that there could be possible liability on the part of directors or even of managers on the basis of employment law, or on the basis of contract law. So, or it could be on the basis of even criminal law, when they potentially breach certain provisions based on the criminal code in Australia or in a particular state. So our focus, therefore, tonight is to kind of go beyond now, beyond the discussion about corporate governance solely from the viewpoint of the law, and to try to look at corporate governance as well from the viewpoint of what is often known as a soft obligation, or coming off a soft law. And in that particular case, this is what is covered in week 4, we talk about the voluntary codes of corporate governance that some companies often enter into. And you will often notice that the bigger companies would have a corporate governance framework, a corporate governance statement. And we examine one of them in a short while, coming from Wesfarmers, which is the corporate owner of such huge companies in Australia, such as Coles, Target, and Bunnings. So they have a corporate governance statements. And we wonder, because a corporate governance statement coming from a company is voluntarily stated, it is a voluntary commitment, does it produce a legal effect? And assuming, if it doesn't have a legal effect, what if a company fails to abide by its statement as stated in a corporate governance code or corporate governance statement? Does it have any effect, including non-legal ones? So that is something we need to examine as well. And in week 5, we have also talked about the idea of corporate social responsibility, because while conventionally, when you look at the Corporations Act and when you look at the company law in general, it is often understood that as far as directors' duties are concerned, it is understood that the duty of a director is actually to promote the best interests of the company. But typically, the definition of what the company is actually the shareholders. So when we say, for example, so when I say conventionally, by tradition, or in general, it is popularly believed in law that the duty of directors to promote the interests of the company is actually to promote the interests of the shareholders. So when I speak of shareholders, these are the individuals or companies who own shares in the company. And which leads to the question, if directors' duties are broadly understood to be in terms of promoting the interests of the company and the shareholders, do they have any legal obligations towards non-shareholders, or what we call stakeholders, or entities or individuals who have a stake in the company, although a non-legal stake? So for example, employees. Employees don't own the company. They don't own any share of the company. Suppliers, you speak of customers, you have the government, you have the environment, and so on. They do not have any legal share or legal ownership of the company. But they do have a stake in the company, because if a company fails, like it had happened in the past when you have massive corporate collapses, which led to employees losing their jobs, which led to the government having to step in to bail out companies, which led to a lot of suppliers down the line, because they couldn't get paid by the companies, they ended up closing their doors as well. And you ended up with a lot of people who lost jobs, and therefore, the government had to bail them out as well. So we do realize, therefore, that as far as the activities of a company is concerned, these activities have an impact not just on the shareholders, but on the broader society. So there are stakeholders. So the question is, if we define the duty of directors to mainly be in terms of promoting the interests of a company, and by extension, the promoting the interests of shareholders, is there a duty on the part of directors to promote, or at least consider, the interests of stakeholders? And we should probably ask the question, would it actually be permissible legally or even morally for companies to totally ignore the interests of stakeholders? So in other words, what if a company publicly states that it doesn't care about the environment, it doesn't care about employees, it doesn't care about customers, it doesn't care about society? What do you suppose is the legal effect? And so therefore, it brings us to the idea that there's such a thing as corporate social responsibility. And corporate social responsibility is simply the idea that a company owes duties beyond the shareholders and also to the broader society. So that every company, because its activities have an effect on society, needs to act in a very socially responsible manner. So that is about corporate social responsibility. So, and then thirdly, apart from having to talk about the voluntary codes of corporate governance that some companies enter into, and apart from talking about corporate social responsibility, we also know that when it comes to the activities of companies and directors and even managers and employees, it isn't really just the laws that kind of drive what they do, but also things such as ethics and corporate culture. And oftentimes we might realize that it is one thing for what the law says, and it's altogether different for a company to publicly say this is what we believe in terms of the corporate governance statement. But in actual fact, when you look at their actual activities as driven by ethics and organizational culture, it's totally a different thing. So that there is oftentimes a disconnect between what the legal duties are of a company and of its directors and what it is actually doing. So they could actually say, we will be, we act in a very socially responsible manner to make sure that we do not harm society and we don't harm the environment. And yet, it is potentially possible that these companies may actually end up polluting the environment, perhaps even buying from companies that engage in child labor or engage in unethical conduct. So our goal, therefore, tonight is to examine the principles on corporate governance and corporate social responsibility and corporate ethics and culture. But at the same time, what we hope to do is to be able to draw a connection between these principles as well as our assessment task. So that's going to be part of what we will do. But as we talk about the three principles, the three topics tonight, we will attempt to try to draw a connection between these topics and our assessments. So before I continue, I want to thank Paul again for staying on. It's quite early for him, and I would wish to thank everyone else who will be joining us. And the crucial point about the way we run this unit on governance and business law is that oftentimes the answers are not that precise. So if a course or a unit in corporate governance were taught as a purely law subject, there oftentimes might be a need to say that this is what the law says. But because we're running this unit as an MBA unit, our idea is really to make sure that the participants, the students, try to immerse themselves in the unit and draw on their own experience so that their own experiences will enrich the discussion of concepts and as well as enable them to appreciate the value of the topics discussed in the unit so that they can then apply the principles that they learn in the workplace. So having discussed the outcomes, what we then need to do for now is, at this point, to go through discussion question 1. And because I only have Paul with me tonight, I'll probably ask Paul to, provide, have a greater involvement as we go through the tutorial. Would that be all right, Paul? Okay, thank you. So do you mind reading discussion question 1, and then we can go have a discussion. So in other words, it's just a conversation we're having. So it's like a talk show that we have, okay? So imagine we have a talk show, whether on TV or radio, and we have this discussion, and we're hoping that your peers, when they look at the recording, will learn from the discussion we're having. And of course, our discussion will be informed by what we know to be about the law, but at the same time, we will draw on whatever experiences you might have that, have a relevance to the topics we will be discussing. So if you don't mind, can you read discussion question 1 for us?
Okay, so it's a 2017 corporate governance statement by Wesfarmers. The Board of Wesfarmers Limited is committed to providing a satisfactory return to its shareholders and fulfilling its corporate governance obligations and responsibilities in the best interests of the company and its stakeholders. The board aims to protect and enhance the interests of its shareholders while taking into account the interests of other stakeholders, including employees, customers, suppliers, and the wider community.
Let's begin with question 1.
Yep.
Given that the corporate governance statement, for example, of Wesfarmers is voluntary, do you suppose it has a binding legal effect? So let's assume you came across, because this is online, I grabbed it from the internet today, and you saw that. That's what the Board of Wesfarmers is saying. It says it has a responsibility to fulfill its corporate governance obligations and responsibilities in the best interest of the company and its stakeholders. So it's saying, it has responsibilities towards stakeholders. Do you suppose that the corporate governance statement might have a binding legal effect if you came across this?
Well, I'd assume that the statement itself, I don't think has a binding legal effect, but I think it invokes some legal obligations of the company.
That's right. So that's the crucial point there. Because it's actually voluntary, it's really difficult to argue that it has a binding legal effect so that a stakeholder can then say, Wesfarmers, you have an obligation to us. That's really difficult to say. Because in the first place, when you look at the corporate governance statement of Wesfarmers, it is actually stated in in a very broad view. It says governance, obligations, and responsibilities in the best interest of the company and its stakeholders. It is oftentimes what is known as an apple pie and a motherhood statement. It just, what do you mean by that? And when you say in the best interest of the company and its stakeholders, who defines best interests? And in fact, even if you look at a particular stakeholder, such as customers, is it actually possible to say that customers only have one best interest? Because what we need to remember from the viewpoint of customers, some customers may say that they want the best quality, but high quality comes with a price. So high quality, such as Apple, such as an Apple product, has a price. It's very expensive. And some customers will say, we don't mind a lower quality for as long as the price is good. And various stakeholders have various ways of looking at their interests. Same thing with suppliers. So Paul is actually correct in saying, therefore, that given the corporate governance statement is voluntary, it's really difficult to say that it has a binding legal effect. And even if it did, it is really difficult to pin down whether or not there is a breach of a statement because of the broad nature of the statement, as well as the diverse interests among particular stakeholders, among suppliers, among employees. So even employees themselves, it's difficult to say that employees only have one single best interest. Because on the one hand, employees may say they want high salaries, but if you provide them high salaries, it may mean that the company is not really financially viable. Because if you keep on giving a lot of money to employees, it means that in the absence of profits, shareholders and investors may no longer want to put money into the company. And therefore, at some point, the company is unable to attract capital. Okay, so we have a second question here. Now, would the failure of a company to fulfill its voluntary corporate governance statement likely to produce an effect, legal or non-legal?
Yeah, of course. So, it depends what part of the statement it doesn't. It doesn't fulfill. So, in terms of legal effects, if it fails in its actual governance obligations, then I guess there's legal ramifications to that. But from a non-legal point of view, if it says one thing and does something else, then it potentially has a negative impact on its customer base, which is obviously going to then affect profits, etc.
Very good. Are you able to cite examples, Paul, of those instances when a company may say one thing and it does another, and then it has an effect on its customer base? Can you recall any particular examples?
Well, look, I don't know. A recent one's probably this plastic bag thing that I keep reading about. It's happening in Australia at the moment between Coles and Woolworths.
Yeah.
And the constant flipping of I can't remember which one it is. It's either
Coles or Woolies.
Yeah. One of them said they were going to get rid of the plastic bags, and then the next week they were giving them out for free again, and then they had such a negative response from their customer base that they then stopped giving them out for free a week later. So, I guess that's an example.
That's right. So companies actually have to be, as Paul pointed out, companies have to be very careful when they make statements, because there would then be an expectation on the part of the public, the society, that once a company makes a statement, it will adhere to it. And if it doesn't, even if there is no legal effect in the sense that somebody can sue the company, those who are affected, negatively affected by what the company does, can take action. It means, they can go to social media and probably bash the company, or they may refuse to do business with the company. So there is an effect. So the failure on the part of a company to fulfill its voluntary corporate governance statements can have an effect, both legal and non-legal. So it means that companies have to be very careful in articulating these corporate governance statements, including the principles which they would say governs their conduct. Okay, now the third question we probably should clarify would be, can a company with the above corporate governance statement be legally compelled to fulfill its statement that it shall fulfill its corporate governance obligations and responsibilities in the best interest of the company and its stakeholders? Can it be legally compelled?
I wouldn't think so, no.
That's right. So the difficulty really is that, let's begin by talking about shareholders trying to compel a company to adhere to its legal obligation. That alone, by law, is actually difficult, because even assuming that shareholders, and even assuming a majority shareholder, or a group of shareholders who comprise a majority of the owner of shares of a company, let's assume that they are unhappy with what a company has done, or the board of directors has done, because they believe that the board of directors is taking steps that deprive them of profits which they expected by when they invested in a company. So let's assume that they feel that the board of directors have been remiss in their legal duties. The difficulty really is that the shareholders themselves don't really have any authority to compel the board to act to promote their interests, because ultimately it is the board of directors themselves who are really in a position to take action against the company, which is really kind of difficult, because it is the board of directors who are legally responsible, but it is also the board of directors who have the authority to act in behalf of the company. And what we have in law is known as a derivative suit, where it is oftentimes possible for a group of shareholders to take action in behalf of the company, but the derivative suit is oftentimes likely to fail, mainly because courts will strike down attempts on the part of a group of shareholders to compel the company to act in a particular way, mainly because courts and the law in general believe that it is the board of directors that is in the best position to determine the course of action to be taken by the company. So as far as shareholders themselves are concerned, shareholders have strong difficulty trying to undertake legal action to promote their interests, mainly because they don't have that power, they don't have the authority. The authority is of the board of directors. And what the shareholders really can do would actually be to just simply change the board of directors if they are unhappy with the direction of the board. But to compel the board to act in a particular way is quite difficult. The law doesn't really allow that easily, and also because of what is known as the business judgment rule. And the business judgment rule, as a matter of statute law as well as the common law, states that it is the board of directors, for as long as they're acting in a manner that tries to consider the best interest of the company. They're making decisions that are informed, and the board of directors does not have any material interest in decisions made by the company, and at the same time they're acting in good faith. Then, according to both the Corporations Act in Australia as well as the common law, courts should refrain from second guessing or even overturning or reversing decisions made by the board of directors. So that is known as the business judgment rule. So the business judgment rule essentially insulates the board of directors from decisions it makes. It's really difficult for anyone, including shareholders, to say that what the board of directors did is legally wrong and try to stop them from doing anything. So for example, if a board of directors decides to make a speculative acquisition of another company, or assuming that a board of directors decides to make an investment in further plants and machineries and ends up paying less dividends, no shareholder can actually compel the board of directors to change its decisions, for as long as the decisions of the board can be supported by what is known as the business judgment rule. So having clearly articulated the constraints on the part of the shareholders, you can just imagine, therefore, the difficulty on the part of stakeholders. There is no legal mechanism from the viewpoint of company law where stakeholders, meaning the non-shareholders, can actually try to assert their legal rights, because they don't have any. what they can potentially do is that if they believe that a company has violated its promise to try to promote their best interests, such as when they end up polluting the environment, when they end up cheating their customers, or they're coming up with shoddy products, or when they underpay their employees and so on, what stakeholders can do would be to complain to other government agencies to take action against the company. So they could file a complaint with the ASIC, or they could also go to the media to complain about the behavior of the company. But in terms of a legal action, in terms of trying to assert or enforce what they perceive to be legal rights, it is very difficult for stakeholders to try to assert any legal rights that they may have on the basis of company law. Okay, any questions so far, Paul? Before we proceed, so we're good. So we've discussed that. Let's look at question 2. So we've talked about voluntary codes of conduct. What we'd like to do now is to kind of explore the idea of corporate social responsibility. So I'd like to ask you this question, Paul. Looking at the actions and decisions of the company you work with, or any company that you might be familiar with, what has its approach been towards corporate social responsibility?
So I've been in the army for almost 26 years. So
okay, you're actually a military officer. Okay, yeah.
But I guess you could argue that the army, in its own way, has a sense of corporate responsibility or a social responsibility to to its soldiers, etc. So, and in my assignment, I'm looking at army aviation and how it's kind of has a parallels to this corporate governance and social responsibility. So I guess as an example in army aviation and specifically in engineering, a lot of that social responsibility for military aircraft is about looking after the guys who are essentially going to be supported by that plane. So not only the ones that are traveling inside it, but the ones that have to work on it, the ones that I guess it flies over, etc. So you don't want to design something that is going to fall apart in the air and drop pieces on people below.
I see.
You don't want to design an aircraft that incorporates hazardous materials, as an example. I'm not sure if you're familiar with issues in defence, but way back when the maintainers used to jump inside fuel cells for aircraft and scrub them with quite a toxic cleaner, and and over a number of years they did this, and there was all sorts of issues with the guys that were in there doing that. They had birth defects in their kids, they had health problems and all sorts of things. So I guess from a social responsibility point of view, even though we can do something, doesn't necessarily mean that we should.
Interesting. Maybe I should ask you a question, Paul, if you can, to give your views about the conduct of war. In the sense that when a country, for example, such as Australia, might be engaged in war with another country, and you can talk about another example, and obviously you want to win over your enemy. Is it still possible for a country engaged in war to be socially responsible? In the sense that I recall during World War II, I think the Allied powers tried to not bomb, certain historic sites in Germany and even Austria, even if it meant that, there were certain military installations of Nazi Germany that were not affected. And you contrast that with what's going on in Syria and Afghanistan, where it's like war at all costs. And it doesn't matter, how many people get killed. It doesn't matter how many historic and very important sites get destroyed. So the question really, for me, I think, and I'd like to hear your viewpoint on this, What is your view about the Australian Army? Is it possible, as far as engaging in war or preparing for war or preparing for defense of Australia, does the Army adhere to the idea that it has to act responsibly to society?
So I guess there's two parts to that.
Mm-hmm.
The first part is that, just like a corporation, there's certain rules and regulations that we need to abide by in war. So a bunch of Geneva Conventions and all that sort of thing. So we can't just go around indiscriminately killing people.
Okay.
And there's also rules about enemy combatants. Once they're wounded or taken out of the battle, you can't. If you've ever seen what's it called? That old Boer War movie. I can't remember what it's called now, but executing prisoners and things like that you're not allowed to do, right? So I mean, there's that part, which is the legal part, but there's also and Australians typically historically have been very good at this. It's what you would call a hearts and minds campaign.
Okay.
In that you, I guess you try and tread lightly in a company because you want to win the hearts and minds of the people who like the general population, because that's essentially how you would win a war is, if you look at the Afghanistan situation, you can't just go in there and kill all the Taliban, because essentially they're part of the local population, and you kill one and another one pops up, right? But if you can empower the people and get them to understand that they actually do have a say, they don't have to, I guess, bow down to these bullies. Then rather than just going and killing everyone, you can transfer the power to those guys, and I guess try and create a peaceful situation, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
So yes, you're right. So my view is there's, as I said, there's two parts. There's the legal obligations that we might have as a soldier going to a company where we can't just kill everyone. But there's also that social part where you don't want to kill everybody. You want to limit collateral damage and things like that, so that you're essentially making friends with the people who are there and not turning them against you and creating a big situation.
Interesting. Okay, thank you for that. I learned a lot from that. Thanks. If you don't mind, we'll move on to discussion question 3. And so the idea really is that even in your case, Paul, although you're not connected with a private company, you do relate and you do engage with companies because they produce goods, they produce services. And so it could be that you're dealing with Apple computers or cell phone companies, car companies, and so on. So from the viewpoint of a consumer or of a customer, do you subscribe to the idea that companies should be managed for the exclusive pursuit of shareholder wealth?
So I would say yes, I do. However, I think part of that pursuit is this idea of corporate responsibility and producing things that are good for the environment, good for shareholders, good for the customers, etc., good for the employees of the company, because essentially what that's going to do is produce, I think, will essentially produce larger profits in the long run. So while I do subscribe to this idea, I don't subscribe to the idea that you do it by cutting corners and like going the easy route, if that makes sense.
So let's try to frame that statement in even more stark terms. So let's assume that a company says that our obligation is solely to our shareholders to make sure that they become wealthy. And we do not care, therefore, about the interests of stakeholders. How would that idea strike you?
So, see, I think that's a different statement.
Okay, go on.
Because I don't think that is in pursuit of shareholder wealth. That's in pursuit of a quick buck, right? But not long-term wealth.
That's right. I think you've alluded to a very important concept in social responsibility known as the enlightened shareholder value theory. Because on the one hand, traditionally, the idea is known as the shareholder theory is that it is defined as the promoting the interests of the company is about promoting the interests of shareholders. But as you pointed out, oftentimes when you pursue the interests as well of stakeholders, you're thinking about suppliers, you're thinking about creditors, you're thinking about employees, you're thinking about broader society and the environment. What it actually does is that because you're thinking of stakeholders, ultimately, the company generates better business, they have a better market share, and that redounds to shareholder benefits and shareholder wealth. So that there is an argument in the corporate governance discussion or discourse that it shouldn't be just about shareholder theory, but also about the enlightened shareholder value theory that, when you try to consider the interests of stakeholders, ultimately that is an enlightened view because it redounds ultimately to the benefit of shareholders. And it's not about just, as you say, it shouldn't be about just trying to get quick bucks because that's not going to work. Okay, very good. Okay, so this idea, so maybe this is again one way of pursuing that point. Is it feasible for a company today to publicly assert that its duty is exclusively to its shareholders and that it has no duty whatsoever to stakeholders? Can a company do that?
So I would say no, because that flies contrary to the previous point. So I think that, as I said before, I think the duty of a company is to its shareholders. However, a company would be silly to come out publicly and say that. I think part of the marketing strategies, etc., of a company would be to reaffirm to the wider population that it has wider duties in terms of looking after its stakeholders. But I still think that strategically, shareholders are its number one. Like that. That's why they exist, basically. But as you say, the enlightened shareholder theory talks about the wider duty of stakeholders that it really needs to look after, and I think that plays into the long-term success of a company.
But now, when you think about the idea that companies should also consider stakeholders' interests, that's kind of curious because by law, companies and directors, their duties are framed by law only towards shareholders. They don't have any legal obligation towards stakeholders. So what's wrong with a company making a clear statement that we're simply abiding by the law, and because of what the law provides, we define our legal duty to be exclusively to promote the interests of shareholders, to make them happy and wealthy, so that in the process, you probably have a lot of investors buying shares in the company, which brings up share prices and makes a lot of shareholders wealthy. Why can't that be done?
Well, I mean, that's right. They have a lot of investors buying shares in a company, but they buy shares in a company because of the business that the company does. And if a company spreads a negative view of itself, and like a statement like that, I think would be viewed as negative by the wider. Well, again, depending on who the customer base is, but if it's as an example, a supermarket. If the supermarket came out and said, well, we don't care about our customers, we're just going to, all we're trying to do is make profit for our shareholders, then potentially they might lose some business, which then the on-flow effect of that is nobody wants to buy shares in the company and the share prices go down.
That's very good. Now, I'm just thinking that, in the past, I don't know, in the 1900s, of course, we were not born then, 1920s, 1930s, because I recall Henry Ford at one point, during the height and the popularity of the Model Ford T, he was saying that any customer can choose any color he likes for as long as it's black. Yeah. Because, Ford was the dominant company. It just did what it wanted to do. Do you suppose there was a time when a company could actually get away with the idea that its sole motivation was just to make shareholders happy and, to hell with the rest of the world? Was there a time, do you suppose, that could have been possible?
Yeah, of course. And look, realistically, that's still possible now. If you had a company that was the only company that produced a product that everybody wanted, then potentially the CEO could come out and say, well, too bad. You get what you get, and we're not doing anything different. But as soon as you get competition in the market, then I guess those, like, okay, as a good example is the taxis. Taxis in Australia up until a few years ago could basically do what they wanted. They had a monopoly on the market. You introduce ride-sharing apps like Uber and Lyft and things like that, and suddenly they have to compete.
Yeah.
So, there's an example of an industry that basically said to everybody, we're essentially going to give you what you get, right?
Yeah.
Until you introduce a competitor, and then they have to start changing.
That's right. I suppose the same thing could be said. I don't know if it's stretching the metaphor, or the analogy. If you look at universities before, universities, even in Australia, didn't really care much about what students thought. So, universities like the University of Sydney, perhaps University of Queensland, ANU, they didn't mind flunking students, even if they weren't happy, move away. And yet today, there seems to be a change in the environment so that, the viewpoints of students have become really important. Do you suppose that this captures the idea that, universities' obligations don't just, it's not just about, providing education, but making sure that, students could also be seen as some kind of a customer? Is that part of it? Yeah, perhaps.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Now, moving on. How long do you have, Paul? You said you only have an hour.
Oh, look, I could probably push out another 15 minutes.
Okay, very good. Okay, because actually at about 10 discussion questions here, all the way to there, but we're not going to get there. And I'm really happy, Paul, that I'm able to get a lot of these new ideas from you. Thanks. So let's see, where are we now? Did we jump a question here? Or we could just jump there. Discussion question 6. Paul, do you mind reading that discussion question for us?
So assume you're a director of a pharmaceutical company that has fully developed and tested a vaccine that can help prevent the deaths of 1 million individuals each year. If the company releases the vaccine today, it stands to reap $10 million in profits. If, however, the company delays the release of the vaccine 5 years hence in order to build up its distribution and marketing network, it stands to reap $1 billion in profits. In the process, however, 5 million individuals will continue to die. What would you do?
Okay. Paul, I'd like to hear, give yourself some time to think about this. Put yourself in the position of being a director of such a company.
Look, it's a pretty big ethical question. I don't know what I'd do. So I think that potentially there's things that the company could do in rolling out a rolling release, I guess, to potentially help some of those individuals. Are we assuming that that they're in a position regulatory wise, they've done all their tests, etc.
Yeah.
To release the thing today?
Let's assume that they could safely release it today.
Yeah.
But if they do so, they can only generate little limited profits because they haven't really created, for example, the marketing network, and they haven't created intellectual property issues, which means there could be another competitor which would come up with another product. But if they delay it, by the time they release it, everything is ready. They're going to reap millions in profits. If you were the director, what would you do? Let's assume for the moment it's an either-or thing. It's one or the other. There is no middle ground.
Yeah. Look, I don't know. I think that you would have to have pretty big kahunas if you waited to make the $1 billion, because if the public ever found out about this, then your company would be in the bad books for a long time.
That's right.
So look, I think realistically you'd almost have to you'd have to release it straight away.
Right.
But that being said, as I said before, the shareholders are your number one and it's a big difference, 10 million to a billion.
Mm.
Look, I don't know. It would be a hard question. I think it'd be very difficult to defend the decision if you didn't release it straight away.
That's right.
And in fact, legally, you might find it very difficult to defend your decision.
Yeah. Another example we have is, I think, what happened in the United States, where there was this drug by this guy, was it Zelensky or something?
Yeah.
Bought a small pharmaceutical company, and he priced his drug overnight by almost 1,000 times more expensive. He made so much money, but the United States consumers were very angry, including U.S. senators such as Hillary Clinton at that time. Do you remember that story?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I mean, legally, he could do what he did. Legally.
Yeah. So I think that question's a little bit different because the drug was already available. I mean, he did increase the price, so essentially it was still available if you wanted it. But if this was the case where the drug was not available, you're not even giving anybody a chance to get access to it. In which case, as I said, I think that there'd be some sort of group lawsuit of families of people who died to sue the company.
Yeah, because the drug was no longer affordable to them, and a lot of them died. That's right. That potentially could be legal liability. Interesting point. Yeah. The other question I had, Paul, was giving this particular example, looking at World War II. I want to get your thoughts. Again, this is about social responsibility as a military person. During World War II, you will recall that what the United States did was to drop 2 atomic bombs, one in Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki. And that, of course, caused, if you've been to Japan, that obviously caused, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Japanese, a lot of them civilians. The United States could have dropped the bomb on where the emperor was. It did not. Instead, it dropped it in major centers, major cities in Japan. And the reason for that was that they felt that, by demonstrating its military prowess, it was likely to lead to a capitulation on the part of the Japanese military, but it was at a huge cost. What do you think about that? So on the one hand, perhaps the argument could be that, if they did not drop the atomic bomb and kill hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, the war was likely to get more protracted. It would probably end maybe 10 years hence. There'll be deaths among soldiers and other civilians anyway. And on the other hand, if you drop the bomb straight away and kill, millions, including those who die from radiation and so on, it likely means that the Japanese military establishment would be forced to surrender. What are your thoughts about that?
Look, it's an interesting question. History shows that it ended the Second World War, or Japan's involvement in the Second World War. So, that strategy worked. Potentially dropping on a different target, would it have worked? Who knows? I mean, if they'd killed the emperor, the psyche of the Japanese military, maybe it would have strengthened their resolve to to all fight until the very end and protract the war even longer. I don't know. I guess that all I will say is that certain things are done in war that and decisions are made during in the heat of battle. As for a bit of a wank word, that looking back on it when the dust has settled, you potentially could have made a different decision, but you didn't. So I guess it's very hard to with hindsight re-look at those sort of things. I will say though, there's as a human being, there's certain decisions that you would like to think that you would make, and certain decisions that you wouldn't make. Like if you look at the Germans in the Second World War and concentration camps and things like that, that's something which flies in the face of doing anything constructive for for the world or war or battle, and it's totally repulsive. And
Mm.
even though that the example you gave, looking back on it, is repulsive, it did actually you ended up with the desired effect, I guess.
Mm.
So I know that doesn't really answer your question, but I think it's more of a philosophical question rather than one that you could really answer.
Well, more of an ethical question as well. I mean, I'm just wondering, the people on the aircraft, the bomber and the navigator and the pilot, they knew, I think, what was going to happen. Could they have potentially not dropped the bomb? Because remember, this did not happen straight away, right? I think the first bomb happened, was it in Hiroshima? Then the second one happened in Nagasaki about a day after. So they knew what the effect was. Could they have, from an ethical viewpoint, I wonder if, because you can look at it from the viewpoint of companies today, where you can have a whistleblower purposely saying, "I'm not going to do this because it's just harmful." I wonder if how you look at it from the viewpoint of the military, because you're part of it, and you said you're from, with the aircraft part of the Australian military. What do you think?
So. Yeah, most definitely, and the things times have changed since then. So you look at what they did in the Second World War. They flew bombs. They flew these big bombers over cities and just dropped thousands and thousands of dumb bombs and just blanket bombed everything. There's no way we would do that today. Everything's precision guided. If you've got a target, you can pick out a military target that sits right next to a school and not damage the school, right? So
I see. Okay.
You're exactly right, but again, the decision has to be made on the ground. And I guess if you've got an ethical issue with the decision, with what you're doing, then you have a responsibility to stand up and say, look, this isn't right. I'm not going to execute those prisoners or do, because it doesn't it doesn't sit well with me. It's illegal. It's not the right thing to do. So yes, you're right. The pilot could have done that. It was a different time, and who knows what the outcome would have been if he hadn't dropped that second bomb.
Okay, I'm not gonna keep you longer, Paul. It's 5 o'clock for you by now, and we've been at this for an hour. I suppose this would be a good time to end our conversation, which has been very helpful. And so I thank you, Paul, for being very game in terms of having this discussion and sharing your experience and your insights as a military, as somebody with the Australian military, and sharing your experiences. So thank you, and all the best when you go back to go to the embassy today. Was that right?
Yeah, I've got to head out there in about an hour.
Okay then. Yeah. So I'll see you. I'll catch up with you again soon.
No worries. Thanks, Manjo. Okay. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Paul. See you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.